Can federalism survive? It's up to Congress. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about the issue of federalism. This is the division of powers in the United States between the federal, national government, and state governments and local governments. And under enumerated powers doctrine, under the federal constitution, there are certain enumerated powers given to the federal government, particularly under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that enumerates certain powers for Congress to be involved with vis-a-vis lawmaking. And then under the 10th Amendment, that the rest of the powers are given to the states and the localities. And the idea is that the national government would have fewer powers and the fewest powers to affect local administration, except in certain areas. And so the federal government was tasked with regulating interstate and foreign commerce, creating uniform immigration laws, building roads, bridges, and the like, post offices, intellectual property laws, having courts, ensuring the national defense, and so forth. But one big advantage in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress and the federal government have that the states really do not is the combined power to spend, borrow money, and to print money. The last one really is key there, but the ability to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to get some of that money from the Federal Reserve or from banking institutions or even from foreign governmental banking or central banking institutions. States really can't do that, and they certainly can't print any money. And so with the power of the purse, the government can say, hey, would you like some federal funds? And there's certain strings and terms and conditions that apply. Now, sometimes the condition of federal funding can be used for good, sometimes otherwise. And oftentimes it's up to Congress to determine which direction they want to go on that. And I'll give you a few examples of how this has played out in recent history. In 1974, the Congress used federal transportation funds to set the speed limit to 55 miles per hour. In 1984, it was used to set the national drinking age to 21. Sometimes it can work in reverse, though. In 1995, Congress undid the 1974 55 miles per hour speed limit. Thank goodness. I like getting to places a little bit faster. Other examples include the 2001 No Child Left Behind legislation that conditioned federal education funds on states implementing certain types of standardized testing. Okay, moving forward, in 2010, Congress enacted Obamacare, which included a provision compelling states to expand Medicaid beyond where it was if they wanted to continue to receive any Medicaid funds. So they figure, oh, we'll expand Medicaid, but to induce every single state to expand, we're going to make it a condition for receiving Medicaid funds. But in the 2012 Roberts ruling, the Supreme Court, they didn't strike out all of Obamacare, but they did find that this provision on mandatory Medicaid expansion was unconstitutional. And it said in part, quote, that portion of the Affordable Care Act violates the Constitution by threatening existing Medicaid funding. Congress has no authority to order the states to regulate according to its instructions. Congress may offer to states grants and require the states to comply with accompanying conditions, but the states must have a genuine choice whether to accept the offer. So there, the Roberts ruling, it does appear to put some limitation on this power of the purse to make changes to policy. But if one could argue it's contradictory. If funds are tied to accompanying conditions and the penalty of not complying is to lose the funding, then there really is never a genuine choice. And most grants from the federal government to states are going to be for a very specific purpose anyways. And if you either use it for that purpose or you're not going to get the money at all. It seems what tripped up the federal government, the Congress, in the Obamacare decision was the fact that states were already dependent upon a stream of Medicaid funding, and what the government was doing was changing the terms and conditions by which they could receive it, and saying you have to spend more money if you want to receive any money on the state side, even if the government was saying we're going to cover 95% of the initial costs or what have you. But and so the Roberts definition of coercion, then in this case, seems somewhat contradictory or arbitrary. And so it makes it hard to spot like a real rule that you could follow in the future if you're trying to determine what level of federal dictate to the states would be permissible under the Constitution and which would not be. So I think really what's going to happen here is that whatever standard was set up in the Sebelius decision is going to be implemented by the Supreme Court in the future haphazardly, probably arbitrarily, maybe determined by the policy preferences of the justices or something like that. It's hard to spot a clear rule here because there are so many instances where the federal government has used the power of the purse to compel certain state and local action that have not been found unconstitutional. And I just covered a couple of them there. The drinking age, the 2001 No Child Left Behind standardized testing rule. In 2015, the Obama administration, via the Department of Housing and Urban Development, sought to condition community development block grants on localities, cities, counties making changes to local zoning laws to be more along income and racial guidelines set forth by Housing and Urban Development. This was done pursuant to the Fair Housing Act's mandate to affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, in 2017, the Trump administration sought to condition federal funds on state and local law enforcement cooperation with immigrations and custom enforcement detainer requests. So if a state or local law enforcement institution had a illegal alien in custody, ICE would say, put out a detainer request and say, please remand this person to our custody so we can deport them or refer them to federal authorities. And what some states and localities have been doing, these so-called sanctuary states and cities, has been saying, we're not complying with those detainer requests. So what the Trump administration attempted to do here was say, we're not going to give you federal law enforcement grants if you're not going to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Now, you could say that's probably narrowly tailored to the purpose of those grants, which is to have law enforcement cooperating with federal law enforcement, and I think that's reasonable. And I think most people would agree with that. We don't want states and localities letting drug runners or gang members who are illegal aliens go, and then they could perpetrate violence against American citizens when they shouldn't even be here in the first place. So that kind of runs the gamut of recent examples of the power of the purse that have been used to basically intrude upon state and local prerogatives. The way we tend to look at it here at Americans for Limited Government is exercises of federal power and enumerated powers like commerce or immigration are thought to preempt state exercises in similar areas under Article 6 of the Constitution, because that makes the Constitution and all laws pursuant to it the supreme law of the land. And that's pretty well settled jurisprudence, I think. Just that's what the law of the land is right now. More broadly, since the Civil War, you also have the addition of the 14th Amendment. Now that under the 14th Amendment, no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And then Section 5 of that amendment gives power to Congress to enforce through appropriate legislation the provisions of that article. So this has led to decades of civil rights laws. When you combine it with the interstate commerce powers, this has given the federal government a very significant ability to regulate things like employment discrimination, public accommodations, whether when you're talking about discrimination on the basis of race, sex, or religion, fair housing, and so forth. The aforementioned Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule by the Obama administration was certainly under the Fair Housing Act and certainly would fall under this 14th Amendment civil rights protections. Now, the same year in 2015, the Supreme Court found in Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs v. Inclusive Communities Project, this was a major court ruling, and what it found was that disparate impact analysis under the 14th Amendment could be used to overturn a state's implementation of federal housing grants. So this seemed to uphold something similar to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So for those who were hoping to go to federal court to overturn the Obama fair housing rule, they weren't going to be able to do it because of this Texas decision by the Supreme Court. But just because the federal government can do something under the Constitution, in this case, regulate local zoning, seemingly, by using federal grants and attaching them with terms and conditions, if you want the grant, you have to change your local zoning, doesn't mean they ought to. And in this case, Congress actually did a 180 on the AFFH rule, and they passed a prohibition in the Senate 87-9. It was sponsored by Susan Collins that said, no, you can't use the AFFH and these community development block grants to try to rezone local communities, cities and counties. We're just not going to do that. And we're going to use the power of the purse to prohibit the exercise of federal intrusion into local matters. So this was really novel. And we were a big supporter of this amendment by Susan Collins, and we've been following this issue for years. This was novel because it was sought to use the power of the purse not to exert federal control over a locality, but to limit it. Now, other times, again, lawmakers might find good reasons to compel, for example, local law enforcement cooperation in federal enforcement matters, such as with the ICE detainer problem. ALG, we did support limiting federal law enforcement funds to localities who aren't cooperating with federal law enforcement, because why should the federal government fund a local law enforcement agency that's going to allow federal basically criminals to go free, in this case, illegal aliens? So it seems like a good principle if you're looking for like, well, what's our rule? How do we analyze this? I think a general principle you can think about following is, are the matters that the federal government is seeking to regulate within the scope of enumerated powers under the federal Constitution, like immigration, like commerce, like civil rights under the 14th Amendment? If not, then you might want to think twice about it. But this is where discretion comes in. Ultimately, the people are deciding these issues when they elect representatives in Congress, and they determine what terms and conditions are going to be attached to federal funds, or if they're going to use federal funds, power of the purse, to limit federal actions. And I'll leave you with the close here, because I think this is a good discussion about basically what the extent of federal power ought to be. How much should the national government be getting involved in state and local matters? The lesson here is that the Supreme Court won't always be there to intervene, because the Constitution is not necessarily always an obstacle to intruding on state and local affairs. The federal government is about as limited as the Constitution makes it to be, which is another way of saying that the federal government, the national government, is really, really powerful. More constraints could be added, but that in the Constitution, but that will require more constitutional amendments, meaning in the meantime, within the existing constitutional constraints, therefore, Congress has the ability to further limit the exercise of federal power over the states with the power of the purse. And where necessary, they should probably exercise it more often. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.